This really happened to me, and I've never spoken about it publicly until now. The night it all began, I was standing in my brother's old workshop in San Antonio, staring at the blood-stained oath he'd written decades ago, an oath I thought was nothing more than family lore. But when I found out who mocked his death and tried to erase his legacy, I knew the promise he had once carved into wood would become my revenge. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel. Tell us where you're from and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. I was 66 when the past clawed its way back into my life, dragging me into a war I never thought I'd fight. My brother Jimmy had been gone for over 40 years, but his presence lingered in the workshop at the back of my property in San Antonio, Texas. He built that place with his own hands when we were teenagers. Jimmy was 5 years older than me, and he had always been bigger, stronger, and braver. He was the kind of brother who would punch out a bully for me in middle school, but also stay up late, teaching me how to tie fishing knots or how to sneak into the Majestic Theater without paying. When Jimmy was 18, he swore a blood oath after a betrayal that shook our family. He sliced his palm with a pocket knife, pressed it against mine, and whispered, "If anyone ever tries to take what's ours, we fight back until they're ruined." I was 12, terrified and wide-eyed, and I promised, even though I barely understood what it meant, that oath stayed hidden in the cracks of memory until the day it came roaring back. It started with a letter. A bland, legal-looking envelope dropped into my mailbox on a humid Thursday morning. Inside was a notice from a law firm in Austin, claiming that the land Jimmy had left me, the very property I was standing on, was under dispute. Some developer backed by a wealthy oil family wanted to bulldoze it, claiming Jimmy had never rightfully owned it in the first place. At first I thought it was a mistake, but then I saw the name at the bottom. Clayton Harrington. That name made my skin crawl. Clayton's father, Charles, had been the man who humiliated Jimmy back in the 70s. He was a smug businessman, a man who strutted through San Antonio like he owned it. He and his family cheated my brother out of his first mechanic shop with forged contracts and dirty bribes, leaving Jimmy broke and angry. It was after that humiliation that Jimmy had sliced our palms and made me promise revenge if the Harringtons ever came for us again. And now here they were, decades later, coming not just for me, but for his memory. I stood in that workshop, the letter shaking in my hand, and looked at the old piece of wood Jimmy had carved into. We fight back. Always my brother's blood oath wasn't just a childish ritual anymore. It was a command, and I wasn't about to break it. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table of my small one-story house on the south side of San Antonio, the hum of the ceiling fan above me mixing with the sound of cicadas outside. The legal letter was spread out in front of me, along with old photos of Jimmy and the workshop. I kept running my fingers over the papers, like I could rub the lies away. The Harringtons had money connections and a long history of bending rules until they broke. Clayton Harrington, the son, was worse than his father. I remembered him in high school, cocky, mean, always surrounded by hangerson. He used to drive a cherry red Camaro and laugh at anyone who wasn't part of his wealthy circle. Now he was a grown man in his 60s, but from what I'd heard, his arrogance had only gotten worse. He owned half the oil transport contracts in Texas and had a reputation for making problems disappear. I felt like I was standing in Jimmy's shadow again, just like when I was 12. But then I thought about Jimmy's blood oath, the promise that we wouldn't let the Harringtons take what was ours without a fight. My pulse quickened. This wasn't just about land. It was about honor, memory, and finally standing tall where my brother had been knocked down. The next morning, I went to the Bexar County Courthouse. I wanted to see the paperwork myself. The courthouse had that cold marble smell, like history mixed with dust. I waited in line, requested the case file, and sat at a wooden table flipping through the documents. My heart dropped when I saw the signatures. The Harringtons had filed forged deeds, claiming Jimmy had sold the property back in the 80s for a laughable sum. The notary stamp was fake. I could see it immediately, but unless I proved it, the court might accept it as valid. I clenched my jaw. This was the same playbook Charles Harrington had used decades ago when he stole Jimmy's first garage. The arrogance of it made my stomach burn. They thought no one would fight back this time. They thought I was just an old man who'd roll over and let them take what they wanted. That night, I sat in the workshop with a glass of whiskey and dug through old boxes of Jimmy's things. I found photos, receipts, handwritten ledgers from his shop, and even old Polaroids of him, standing in front of the property when it was just a bare lot. Buried at the bottom was a shoebox with letters, angry letters Jimmy had written, but never sent. Most of them were addressed to Charles Harrington. My brother had documented every dirty trick the Harringtons pulled, every bribe, every time they threatened him. Jimmy had known the day might come when we'd need proof. Reading those letters, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't just protecting a piece of land anymore. I was carrying Jimmy's unfinished fight. The Harringtons thought they had all the power, but they didn't know I had the words of a dead man and the will of someone who had nothing left to lose. The next day, I drove to Austin to meet with the law firm handling the case for the Harringtons. Their office was in a sleek glass building, all polished wood and steel. When I stepped into the lobby, the receptionist looked me up and down, like I didn't belong. Maybe I didn't not in their world. But I wasn't here to belong. I was here to fight. I asked to speak with their lead attorney, a slick man named David Ellison. He finally appeared, tall and thin, wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than my truck. He smiled, that kind of smile people wear when they think they already won. "Mr. Martinez," he said smoothly, "I assume you're here to settle." That would be wise. I set Jimmy's box of letters on the polished conference table and leaned forward. "You tell Clayton this. My brother swore we'd never let your family steal from us again, and I keep my promises." Ellison chuckled like I was a joke. "You're 66 years old. Do you really think you're going to win against the Harringtons?" I stared at him, steady and unblinking. "I think I'm going to bury them." The room went quiet. For the first time, Ellison's smirk faltered. I stood, grabbed the box, and walked out. My hands were shaking, but my resolve was solid. The war had started, and I wasn't going to lose. I drove home from Austin with my knuckles white on the steering wheel. Every mile down, I-35 felt like a march deeper into enemy territory. The Harringtons had money power and lawyers who could twist the truth until it looked like fact. But I had something they didn't: time, rage, and a promise I couldn't break. That night, I sat in the workshop, the familiar smell of motor oil and sawdust thick in the air. Jimmy's handwriting stared back at me from the letters I had pulled earlier. His words were sharp, bitter, filled with fury he never got to unleash. I poured a glass of whiskey, raised it toward the carving on the workbench, and whispered, "We fight back. Always." The next morning, I knew I needed backup. I couldn't go toe-to-toe with the Harringtons' legal army alone. So I called an old friend, Detective Ray Morales, retired, now living in New Braunfels. Ray had been Jimmy's drinking buddy back in the day, and he owed him more than a few favors. When I told him about the forged deed, Ray's voice dropped low. Charles Harrington pulled this same crap back in the 70s. Ray said everyone knew it, but no one could prove it. You sure you want to drag this back up, Ab? Jimmy made me promise, I told him. And I'm not letting them bury his name. Ray sighed heavily. All right. Meet me tomorrow. I'll dig out some old files. The following afternoon, we sat in his garage, surrounded by boxes of dusty case notes. Ray cracked open a file marked Harrington, 1977. Inside were witness statements, complaints, even a few confidential memos. Charles Harrington had bribed zoning officials, paid off inspectors, and used intimidation to snatch up small businesses. Jimmy's garage had been just one casualty in a trail of theft and corruption. None of this ever made it to trial. Ray said, shaking his head. Too many people were scared of him. Too many pockets got lined. I held the pages like they were dynamite. This was more than history, it was ammunition. The Harringtons thought they could roll over me because I was old, but they'd made a mistake. I wasn't scared, and I had nothing left to lose. Within a week of filing my first counterclaim, I started noticing black SUVs parked across from my house. Men in suits loitered near the workshop, pretending to check their phones. One night I came home to find a dead crow nailed to my fence. Its wings were spread wide, its beady eyes staring blankly at me. It was a message clear and simple. Back off. Instead of scaring me, it lit a fire. They were nervous good. That meant I was already inside their walls, but I knew I couldn't do it with just Ray's dusty files and Jimmy's letters. I needed sharper tools, someone who could dig into the shadows of modern corruption. That's when I found Marisol. She was a private investigator in her 40s, wiry, sharp-eyed, and with a reputation for going where others couldn't. When I told her I wanted to take on the Harringtons, she laughed at first. You trying to die early, old man? She asked, leaning back in her chair. Just trying to keep a promise, I said. Her smirk faded. That promise must mean a hell of a lot. It does. That was enough for her. 2 weeks later, she handed me a thumb drive full of surveillance photos, bank records, and confidential emails. Clayton Harrington had been funneling money through shell companies, bribing city officials, and blackmailing competitors into selling their businesses for pennies. It was the same dirty game his father had played, only slicker, more sophisticated. I sat in my workshop late at night, scrolling through the files, while Jimmy's old radio hummed softly in the background. The deeper I went, the more I realized this wasn't just about my property anymore. The Harringtons had spent decades robbing ordinary families blind. My fight had become bigger than me. I wasn't just avenging. Jimmy, I was dragging a dynasty into the light. One evening, as the sun bled orange over San Antonio, Marisol leaned against the doorway of the workshop. You know they're going to come after you hard, right? They'll try to bury you in lawsuits, smear your name, maybe worse. I looked at her, bitter smile tugging at my lips. They already took my brother. What more can they take? She didn't answer. The next morning, I walked into the Bexar County Courthouse with a stack of counterclaims so thick it could choke a judge. Attached were Jimmy's letters, Ray's archived notes, and Marisol's findings. The clerk's eyes widened when she flipped through it. You're taking on the Harringtons, she whispered. Damn right I am, I said. That night my phone rang. A voice on the other end spoke slowly, dripping with arrogance. This is Clayton Harrington. I hear you've been busy digging through the dirt. My chest tightened, but I kept my voice steady. Just making sure your father's sins don't get forgotten. Clayton chuckled low and dark. You think anyone cares about your dead brother? You're an old man, Martinez. By the time this is over, you'll lose everything, your land, your name, maybe even your freedom. I took a breath, forcing my voice to remain calm. My brother once told me, if someone tries to take what's ours, we fight back until they're ruined. You should be left me alone. Clayton. There was silence. Then, the line went dead. I lowered the phone, my hand trembling, not from fear, but from adrenaline. The war was no longer coming. It was here. And for the first time since Jimmy's death, I felt alive. The weeks that followed felt like a chess game, played in shadows. Every morning I woke before dawn, brewed a pot of black coffee and spread papers across my kitchen table, like battle maps. Jimmy's old letters lay side by side with Marisol's files, and Ray's dusty case notes sat stacked like ammunition. The Harringtons struck first. Their lawyers unleashed a storm of motions, each one designed to delay proceedings and bleed me dry financially. They requested continuances, filed objections, demanded irrelevant documents, and even tried to have my counterclaims thrown out entirely. It was death by paperwork, but I had one advantage they hadn't counted on. I wasn't playing their game alone. Ray connected me with a nonprofit legal aid group in San Antonio that specialized in property disputes and elder protection. When I laid out the forged deeds and showed them Jimmy's letters, they leaned in with sharp eyes. One attorney, a young woman named Sophia, tapped her pen against the table. "This is fraud, clear and simple," she said. "And if you're willing to fight, we're willing to stand beside you." That was the first crack in the Harringtons' armor. But cracks weren't enough. I needed an earthquake. The quake came when Marisol intercepted a call between Clayton and a city councilman. On the recording, Clayton's voice was dripping with smugness as he promised campaign donations in exchange for rezoning approvals. It was bribery plain and simple. When she played it back for me in the workshop, my hands shook around the whiskey glass. "This is enough to get the feds sniffing." Marisol said, her eyes glinting. But I wasn't naive. The Harringtons had dodged accountability before. They had friends in high places, deep pockets, and no conscience. I couldn't count on justice to come riding in like some savior. So I decided to hit them where it hurt most, their reputation. I sat at my desk and wrote an anonymous op-ed for the San Antonio Express News. I poured my soul into it, telling Jimmy's story in raw detail, how he'd been robbed, humiliated, and left broken by Charles Harrington, how families across San Antonio had been chewed up by a dynasty of greed. I ended with a warning. The ghosts of the Harringtons' victims are rising. They cannot be buried forever. The paper published it under the title, "The Ghosts the Harringtons Can't Bury." Within days, the article spread like wildfire. Talk radio hosts debated it. Neighbors whispered in HEB aisles. Local TV anchors read excerpts on the evening news. For the first time, people looked at the Harringtons not with awe, but with suspicion. But notoriety came at a cost. One night I returned home to find my workshop ransacked. Jimmy's photos were torn from the walls. His unsent letters lay scattered across the floor, and spray-painted in jagged red across the back door were the words, "Drop it or die." My fists clenched so hard, my knuckles went white. They wanted me scared, broken, silenced. Instead, they made me furious. I called Ray and Marisol. They've declared war. I told them Ray's voice was gravelly but calm. Then we hit back harder. We organized a community meeting at a church on the west side. I expected maybe a handful of people to show up. Instead, the room filled with dozens, small business owners, ex-employees, even a widow whose husband had been conned out of his savings by Charles Harrington years ago. The air was thick with anger and grief as people shared their stories. A mechanic said Harrington inspectors had shut him down for violations that never existed. A restaurant owner claimed Clayton's men pressured her into selling her property at half its value. The widow sobbed as she clutched a faded photograph of her husband, swearing the Harringtons had destroyed their life's work. We documented everything: names, dates, dollar amounts. Piece by piece, we were building not just a case of fraud, but a history of generational corruption. When Clayton caught wind of the meeting, he retaliated with venom. His lawyers filed a defamation suit against me personally, demanding millions in damages. The news ate it up, painting me as a stubborn old man, poking a powerful bear. Friends called me, begging me to walk away before it got worse, but I couldn't not after Jimmy. Not after all those families. The turning point came during a preliminary hearing. My lawyer, Sophia, slid a yellowed envelope across the judge's bench. Inside was one of Jimmy's unsent letters, dated 1978, addressed to the state attorney general. In it, Jimmy described how Charles Harrington had bribed a judge to dismiss a case against him. The courtroom went silent as the judge read it aloud. Then Marisol pressed play on the intercepted call between Clayton and the councilman. Clayton's voice filled the room, casual and confident as he laid out the terms of his bribe. The judge's face tightened. For the first time, I saw panic flicker across Clayton's eyes. Outside, the courthouse reporters swarmed me. Cameras flashed, microphones jutted forward. "Mr. Martinez, are you afraid of going up against the Harringtons?" one of them asked. I stared into the lens, my voice steady. "I buried my brother when I was 24. Fear doesn't live in me anymore." That night, I sat alone in the workshop staring at Jimmy's carved words. "We fight back." Always the war wasn't over, but I could feel the tide shifting. The Harringtons were bleeding. Their name was tarnished. Their empire was trembling, and I was just getting started. The courthouse became my battlefield, and every hearing felt like another round in a long, brutal war. By now, the Harringtons had thrown everything at me. Teams of lawyers in suits so sharp they could slice through paper, endless motions and objections, and aggressive countersuits that read more like threats than legal arguments. They thought they could drown me in paperwork, crush me under the weight of procedure. But I refused to sink. Every morning I rose before dawn, made myself a pot of black coffee, and spread documents across my kitchen table until there was no room left. Jimmy's letters, Ray's old files, Marisol's evidence, each one a weapon, each one a reminder. One morning I walked into the Bexar County Courthouse and nearly froze when I saw him, Clayton Harrington himself, sitting in the gallery's front row. His gray suit was tailored to perfection, his silver hair combed back, and his smirk sharpened to a knife's edge. His eyes locked on me, as if daring me to flinch. The judge hadn't even entered yet, but the battle had already begun. During that hearing, Sophia presented Marisol's research on the Harrington's shell corporations. We displayed flowcharts of money moving through fake companies, screenshots of wire transfers and invoices signed by ghost employees. The evidence filled the courtroom, projected on a large screen. I watched Clayton's smirk tighten into a scowl. For the first time, he leaned toward his lawyers, whispering furiously. I had drawn blood. When the hearing ended, I walked outside into a storm of reporters. Microphones shoved into my face, cameras, flashing voices overlapping. "Mr. Martinez, why keep fighting? Are you afraid for your safety? Do you think you can really win?" I raised my voice above the noise, steady and clear. Because my brother never got justice. Because families like mine have been chewed up and spat out by men like the Harringtons for too long. And because a promise is a promise. The clip went viral. Suddenly, I wasn't just some stubborn old man in San Antonio. People across Texas and even beyond were watching. Strangers sent letters of encouragement. Neighbors brought me meals, and veterans told me I was giving them hope. For the first time in decades, the Harringtons weren't feared. They were hated. That's when Clayton showed me who he really was. Late one night as I drove home from the courthouse, headlights flared in my rearview mirror. A black SUV latched onto my bumper, too close, too fast. My heart pounded as I swerved onto a side road, but the SUV followed its engine roaring like a predator. My old truck rattled no match for their speed. At the last second, I cut hard onto a gravel road, leading to an abandoned feed store Jimmy and I had haunted as kids. The SUV tried to follow, but its tires lost grip, fishtailing wildly before sliding into a ditch. I floored it, my chest tight with adrenaline, until I reached my workshop. I killed the engine, shut off the lights, and sat in the dark for an hour, shotgun across my lap, waiting. They never came to the door. But the message was clear. This was more than lawsuits now. Clayton wanted me gone. Instead of scaring me off, it hardened my resolve. The next morning, I filed a police report and gave Ray the license plate number I'd memorized. He worked his old contacts, and within days, he called me back. That SUV's registered to one of Clayton's companies. Ray said, reckless, sloppy, but enough to put the heat on him. Meanwhile, Marisol uncovered the smoking gun we desperately needed. The notarized deed the Harringtons claimed proved Jimmy sold the property in 1982. It was fake. The notary stamp belonged to a man who hadn't even been licensed until 1984. Clear-cut forgery. When we presented that evidence in court, the room erupted. Clayton's lawyers scrambled, raising objection after objection, but the judge silenced them with a thunderous crack of his gavel. The evidence is clear. The judge said firmly, this deed is fraudulent. Clayton's face flushed crimson. His jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. For the first time, his mask slipped. That evening, I returned to Jimmy's workshop. The Texas dusk painted the sky in crimson and gold as I ran my fingers over the scarred wood where he had carved our oath. We fight back. Always, I whispered it aloud, the words thick on my tongue. For the first time in years, I felt Jimmy beside me. But I also knew one thing: cornered animals bite hardest. Clayton wasn't finished. His empire was cracking, his reputation tarnished, but he would never surrender quietly. The question wasn't if he'd strike again. It was when, and I swore he'd be ready. 2 weeks later, Clayton struck again, but this time not with intimidation in the shadows. He went for spectacle. It was a sweltering Monday morning when I walked into the courthouse and found the lobby crawling with reporters. Flashbulbs popped, cameras rolled, voices buzzed like angry bees. At the top of the courthouse steps stood Clayton Harrington himself, speaking into a row of microphones, as though he were the governor of Texas. "This old man," he said, jabbing his finger toward me as I climbed the steps, "is trying to drag my family's good name through the mud for his own selfish gain. My father was an honorable businessman. The Harrington family has served this community for generations. We will not be bullied by lies and conspiracy theories." The crowd of reporters pivoted toward me, microphones thrust into my face, questions overlapping. The sun bore down, hot and relentless sweat stinging my eyes. I steadied myself, inhaled, and let my voice cut through the noise. "Your father was a thief," I said, "and you're worse. This isn't about money. This is about every family you ruined. You want to bury me. Try it, but don't think for a second that it'll go quietly." Gasps rippled through the crowd. For just a flicker of a second, Clayton's polished mask cracked his face, flushing with fury, before his handlers yanked him back inside. That clip hit the evening news in San Antonio, Austin, and even Houston. The battle lines weren't just in court anymore. They were in the public square. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I sat in the workshop. Jimmy's letters spread across the workbench. Marisol and Ray were with me, both silent, both knowing how far this had gone. "They're not just trying to win," Marisol said finally, her voice low. "They're trying to crush you in public so no one else dares to stand against them again." Ray leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped. "You've got enough evidence now to bury Clayton in fraud, forgery, and bribery. But if you want to finish this, you need to take it higher. Federal higher. This ain't the FBI, the Department of Justice." The thought made my stomach tighten. I looked at Jimmy's oath carved into the wood grain. "We fight back, always then." "That's what will do," I said. The next morning, Marisol and I drove to the FBI field office in downtown San Antonio. We carried 2 cardboard boxes filled with evidence. Jimmy's letters, Ray's old case files, Marisol's recordings and financial trails, and the forged deed itself. Agent Carter, the same man who had once dismissed my claims as a local property. Squabble leaned in with sharper eyes this time. "This is serious," he said, after flipping through the forged deed. "You realize you're accusing one of the most powerful families in Texas of organized fraud and corruption." "I'm not accusing them," I said, improving it. Carter promised to open a preliminary investigation. It wasn't the final nail, but it was the first time I felt federal teeth sinking into the Harrington's flesh. Of course, Clayton didn't roll over. He doubled down. 2 days later, my face was plastered across the evening news, but not for my words. This time, it was for lies. A supposed police report leaked claiming I'd been arrested in the 80s for assault and petty theft, completely fabricated. But the story spread fast, social media tearing me apart. "Old man with a grudge," one headline sneered. "Is he trustworthy?" another asked. For a moment I felt the shame. The weight of strangers' judgment pressed heavy on my chest. But then I remembered. Jimmy humiliated, cheated, left with nothing. I clenched my fists and swore I wouldn't let them break me the way they broke him. At the next hearing, I walked into the courthouse with my head high, ignoring the whispers. Marisol sat beside me, Ray in the row behind, both steady as anchors. Across the aisle, Clayton lounged like a king, smug grin plastered across his face. But that grin faltered when the judge called for evidence. Sophia, my lawyer, presented the notary records proving the deed was impossible. Marisol queued up the intercepted recording with the councilman. Piece by piece, their empire of lies unraveled under the sterile glow of the courtroom lights. Clayton's grin collapsed into a clenched jaw. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the table. The judge didn't rule that day. Too many moving pieces, too much to weigh, but the damage was done. The Harrington's mask had slipped in full view of the public. As I walked out of the courthouse, the cameras swarmed again. Reporters shouted questions. People in the crowd clapped me on the shoulder, whispered words of encouragement. For the first time, I realized something. The Harringtons were no longer untouchable, and I was nowhere near finished. Clayton's empire didn't crumble all at once. It cracked slowly, piece by piece, like glass under pressure. By early fall, whispers spread through San Antonio's business community. Contracts were being canceled. Politicians who once bragged about Harrington donations now dodged questions. Board members quietly resigned from his companies. The Harrington name, once spoken with fear and respect, now carried the weight of scandal. But cracks don't destroy dynasties. You need a hammer. That hammer came when Marisol unearthed a whistleblower buried inside Harrington Oil Transport. The man had saved a string of emails and internal reports that detailed years of illegal dumping of toxic waste near the Guadalupe River. For years, the Harringtons had been bribing inspectors to look the other way, while poisoning the land and water. It was explosive, the kind of evidence that didn't just chip away at a reputation, it obliterated it. The night Marisol slid the printed emails across Jimmy's old workbench, rain hammered the workshop roof. She folded her arms, her sharp eyes cutting into me. "You realize if we go public with this, it's not just about your land anymore," she said. "It's about taking down everything they've ever built, and they'll come at you harder than ever, maybe even lethal." I ran my hand over Jimmy's carved oath, the grooves worn smooth from decades. "They already made me a target," I said. "Now it's time I make them one." Within a week, Agent Carter and a federal team descended on Harrington Oil's offices in San Antonio and Houston. The story broke like a thunderclap. Headlines screamed, "Harrington Oil under federal investigation for environmental crimes." Stock prices plummeted. Investors panicked. Television anchors spoke about it with wide eyes, their voices laced with shock. For the first time, Clayton wasn't the predator. He was the prey. But predators don't die easy. One night my phone rang. Clayton's voice came through ragged, dripping with rage. "You think you've won Martinez. You're nothing but a bitter old man, clinging to a dead brother's ghost. I will bury you in so much litigation. Your grandchildren will still be paying it off." I let the silence hang my pulse steady. Jimmy may be gone, but his oath lives in me. "You already lost, Clayton. You just don't know it yet." The line went dead, but his fury lingered like static in the air. The next hearing was standing room only. The courthouse crackled with tension. Reporters lined the back pens, scratching cameras rolling. Clayton sat at the defendant's table, his suit immaculate, but his face pale, a twitch working in his jaw. His lawyers hurled objections like stones, but the judge's patience wore thin. Sophia stood tall, her voice ringing through the chamber as she presented the notarized deed, the linchpin of their claim. The judge examined it carefully, then compared it with official records, his brow furrowed. He tapped his gavel against the bench, once then again, his voice sharp as a blade. "This document is fraudulent," he declared. "Mr. Martinez retains rightful ownership of the property." The courtroom gasped. Clayton surged to his feet, shouting protests, his voice cracking with rage. The judge slammed the gavel again, silencing him with a glare that could cut glass. It was over. The reporters swarmed me outside the courthouse, their microphones jabbing forward like spears. "Mr. Martinez, how do you feel?" one asked. I looked up at the Texas sky, the storm clouds finally parting to reveal a blaze of sunlight. My chest ached with something between grief and triumph. "My brother can finally rest," I said. That evening I returned to the workshop alone. The air was still the wood, faintly scented with oil and dust. I poured a glass of whiskey and sat at Jimmy's workbench. My hand traced the oath carved deep into the wood grain. "We fight back. Always." For the first time since I was a boy, I felt the promise fulfilled. But the silence of the workshop pressed in heavy, and I knew something darker too. Victory came with a cost. The Harringtons weren't finished. Clayton had lost his land grab. His father's legacy was collapsing. His empire was bleeding. But a man like him doesn't fade quietly into the night. He festers, he plots, he waits. I whispered into the stillness as though Jimmy were standing at my side. "If he comes again, brother, he'll be ready." Outside, cicadas sang into the thick Texas night, and in that eerie stillness I realized something chilling. Revenge doesn't end when you win. It ends when your enemy is gone. The end.